Hello and welcome to another edition of Resistance TV. As you probably know, the Resist movement joined forces with the Workers' Party earlier this year, and the Workers' Party Congress at the weekend, I was elected as the deputy leader. And since that time, I'm delighted to say that the campaigning GP, Bob Gill, has now decided to join the Workers' Party as well. Bob has been campaigning about the destruction of the National Health Service now for a good number of years and produced an excellent film called The Great NHS Heist. And if you haven't already seen that, it's well worth a watch. You can Google it and find it on YouTube. I'm not sure if it's on other platforms as well, but I believe it's certainly on YouTube, and it's certainly well worth a watch and well worth a share as well. So if we could get Bob on the screen, and it's good to have you on board. Bob, welcome to Resistance TV again.
Hi, Chris. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, good. Well, I mean, let's just go straight into it then, Bob. I mean, I know you've been thinking about joining the Workers' Party for some time, and you've finally taken the plunge. Just tell us why you've actually made the decision now to join forces with us.
Well, I think the what concentrated my mind was the recent unfolding humanitarian disaster in Gaza, which seems to have the endorsement of the Labour Party. Our political elite are quite happy to endorse genocide. And I think people need to realize if you can endorse genocide abroad, you can bring very dangerous policies at home. And unfortunately, my experience of campaigning on the NHS for about 10 years now, it's clear to me that what we have in place is a cross-party consensus, which is dismantling public services and clearly premeditatedly putting patients at risk of harm and death. I came up to the Workers' Party open meeting on Saturday, and what I heard, I liked, and I thought, well, if not now, when? And the Workers' Party seems to be aligned with many of my views on what needs to happen to make this country a fairer society, particularly reverse the trend to exacerbate gross inequality, and diversion of money to the super rich.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, the Workers' Party was founded in 2019, 2020, I think, or certainly after the 2019, just after the 2019 general election, which was obviously in December. I think it was early 2020 when it actually got founded fully. And I mean, since that time, it's been on a growth trajectory. Members are seemingly, flocking to join the Workers' Party. Is still a small entity at the moment, but I think it has the chance to potentially make a breakthrough in the election. When you were there, Bob, so you will have heard George talking about this. He's identified, a number of seats where the Workers' Party could make a breakthrough. Do you feel yourself, you get a feeling that there's a chance for the Workers' Party to make an electoral impact at the next election?
Well, I think there are many people like me who feel politically homeless. The Labour Party has shown itself to be endemically corrupt. They sabotaged their own election chances in 2019. You had one PLP coup against Corbyn after the other, and they're quite happy with the neoliberal policies of the Conservative Party. So in reality, there will be no change simply getting a Labour government. So I think there's a lot of people like me. There's a lot of people who are totally disillusioned, don't even get out and vote. So that's what we need to tap into. And what I heard at the Workers' Party meeting was this willingness to work with other groups, because the last thing we need is multiple challenges to the neoliberal status quo and just splitting the vote. So, if we can work collectively with other groups, then I think there's a good chance to make a breakthrough.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know about you, Bob, but certainly when we took the decision to join the Workers' Party, I mean, we've been collaborating with the Workers' Party since it was established. And I just think that the Workers' Party program is a program which talks about some of the big issues that are important to working class communities. There's less of an emphasis on identity politics and more of a focus on class politics, on economic inequality, and addressing the scandal of the war machine that has caused so much destruction and devastation around the world. And we're seeing this obviously right now in Gaza with the genocide that is being perpetrated by the Zionist entity, aided and abetted by the United Kingdom and the United States of America. And of course, you've got NATO's proxy war in Ukraine, which is, again, there's a bipartisan support for that war. Indeed, it's more than a bipartisan support. I think all of the mainstream political parties that are represented in the Houses of Parliament all support NATO's proxy war. Do you get a sense that the program, the Workers' Party program, has a better chance of connecting with people and resonating with people? What's your thoughts about the 10-point program that the Workers' Party has adopted?
Yeah, I think the key pillars are, working in the public interest, trying to reverse the neoliberalism that's taken place over the last 30 to 40 years, because there has been a political duopoly in this country. Starmer has shown himself to be a blatant liar. He made all these pledges and pretended to be a sort of progressive candidate, but he has U-turned on all his pledges. You cannot believe a word he says. He was also instrumental in ruining Labour's chances in 2019 with the People's Vote, and being party to the or being very silent, at least in terms of the smear campaign against Corbyn. So there is nothing to see on the shadow front bench that should fill anybody who's keeping an eye on what's going on in this country with any hope that there will be meaningful change. Um, the European economies, the EU and NATO and the UK, seem quite willing to inflict self-destructive policies or support self-destructive policies for which the average person in the street pays a price through worsening economic hardship, through decimation of public services. I'll give you one example. So none of these politicians who occupy our screens were able to point out the reality of what happened in Ukraine. We had a censorship about the Ukraine coup in 2014. I went online and happened to find, or somebody pointed me in the direction of the Oliver Stone film Ukraine on Fire, and I watched it, and I got very quickly a background to the Russian military action there. So I thought, well, this, you can understand why Russian-speaking citizens in the south of Ukraine feel threatened and why they might want to be part of Russia. Um, but then you hear channels like YouTube and others banning the film. Now, that is not a good sign for a functioning democracy where you cannot have open debate. And I'm afraid, what we have is a duopoly in bed with the mainstream media, acting at the behest of the American empire, I'm afraid, and inflicting economic damage by allowing cheap Russian gas to be the pipeline to be destroyed, and even having the cheek to try and blame Russia for bombing their own expensive infrastructure. You couldn't, the lies are getting more and more gross and more jarring. I think people with a cursory interest in politics start to scratch their heads and think, hang on, that doesn't make any sense whatsoever.
Mm. Some people continue to say that Labour is the lesser of two evils, and that by supporting alternative political parties, it would just let the Conservatives in. I mean, what would your response be to people who hold that view at the moment?
Yeah, I think it's pretty naive. My biggest preoccupation is to try and prevent the decimation of the NHS, but Labour are fully on board with that. West Streeting, Keir Starmer have both said openly, quite blatantly, they welcome the private sector into the NHS. In fact, recently West Streeting said, we will show them the front door, forget the back door, we'll get the private sector further in through the front door. So these people are brazen in terms of the disrespect they have for our public services, presenting the profit extraction from NHS budgets as a solution to any of the crisis that they've been party in developing. We know the 13 years of the Blair Brown government did not meaningfully change the prospects for the working people in this country. In fact, they doubled down on Thatcher's policies in terms of public sector privatization. We had the catastrophe of the Iraq War under the camouflage of being Labour. In fact, the Labour politicians have got away with more than perhaps the Tory party might have done, because the Labour supporters went to sleep. So this faith in Labour is more of a cult worship. The reality is the policies and the rhetoric are deeply divisive and deeply damaging to the country, and we need an alternative. I'm not prepared to just vote like a robot for the Labour Party. The last time I voted for them was in 1997, when I fell for the charm offensive by Blair. I thought, this guy looks like a breath of fresh air, but within months he was selling passports to donors and carrying on the job of Margaret Thatcher. So I thought, no matter how good the presentation, the rot is very deep, and our political class are serving multinational corporations, the City of London, and the American war machine, I'm afraid.
Yeah, and of course, Tony Blair infamously said his job was to, or he saw his job was to build on Thatcher's achievements rather than tear them down. I mean, I'm not aware of any achievements that you could be content with that Thatcher introduced. But you mentioned Wes Streeting, who is, of course, the Shadow Health Secretary, who seemingly is, as you say, on board with the private sector having the big role in the National Health Service. I wonder whether, Bob, for our viewers, you might just sort of set out briefly what the challenges are in terms of trying to reverse this juggernaut, and what damage has already been done to the National Health Service.
Yeah, so what a genuine political party that is interested in the NHS should be calling for is renationalisation, because we've had decades of sequential changes in the law which have effectively repurposed the NHS, the last of which went through Parliament last year without any public discussion. The 2022 Health Act has now in law created 42 new legal entities called integrated care systems, which are public-private partnerships modeled on the American managed care system, dominated by private companies, which will be given the freedom to use public budgets to decide on which care they provide, and any money not spent on care will be kept as profit. So that means denial of care is part of the business plan. And we didn't get there in one big step. We got there by a succession of small steps, each of which are cleverly marketed to us with a sales pitch of somehow this reform will improve the NHS. But each successive reform has made the NHS weaker, more marketized, and diverted money away from the delivery of care. Most egregiously, private finance initiative, which saddled the NHS with borrowed 11 billion. We're going to pay back over 80 billion over a period of 30 to 50 years, at the end of which we don't own the hospitals. And at the same time, NHS capacity has been halved over the past 4 decades. So this is a financial scam, shrinking NHS estate, reducing the number of beds, transferring ownership to the private sector, and lining the pockets of the banks and the financiers. That was under Labour. What else have they done? They have removed the GP monopoly of providing care. They've gradually introduced private providers who've taken over out of hours care. Increasingly, they're taking over general practices. And, a business is only interested in undertaking work from which they can make a profit. And the way they do that is to run down services, to frighten off sick people who might be expensive, to employ the cheapest number of staff, cut corners as much as possible. And clearly you're going to have an impact on safety and quality of care. But that doesn't matter, because as long as the profit's coming in and the regulators turn a blind eye, there's no damage done to their bottom line, which is to satisfy shareholders and extract a profit.
Mm. In your role as a GP, Bob, I mean, I guess you've seen the consequences of the sort of neoliberal agenda that's been pursued for the last 40 years in terms of how it's impacted on your patients. I mean, how has it affected people that you deal with compared to what potentially could have been the situation if we'd have had a fairer society, a more equitable society where we eradicated poverty and the consequences of poverty that so many people experience with presumably health outcomes and so on. So what's been your sense of how that's affected your patients?
Yeah, so the economic system we have is about exploitation. So if you degrade workers' rights, if you don't protect their incomes, if you don't give them a decent wage, that has a direct effect on that person, has a direct effect on the family. So you have a chronic increase in stress, and we know stress is a killer in terms of heart disease and other problems in health. People become depressed, so the mental health is affected. They may turn to drugs or alcohol as a way of coping. They can only afford cheap food. There's no time for rest and relaxation. Now, if you add all these pressures onto people, well, that's going to have a physical effect and a mental effect on their health. So we're actually, through running a system like this, creating more and more sick people. Now, even on basic economic terms, if you have a sick workforce, they're not going to be very productive. And there's an article in the Financial Times, I think it was about a year ago, which showed the numbers mounting on the waiting list actually equated to the same number of people no longer available for work. So this is economically devastating. It's devastating to individuals and to families and to society as a whole. So that's the sort of economic aspect of it. In terms of NHS fragmentation and marketization, well, what that has done is made the NHS less cohesive and dysfunctional. So you have hospitals that are overstretched, unable to deliver timely and safe care. People go to A&E and get discharged. Either they wait for hours in A&E and decide they're going to go home, or when they're assessed, they're not adequately assessed. They might be assessed by non-doctors or very junior doctors, not necessarily getting a senior overview. More and more risk is being taken with the patients. And where do they end up? They end up coming back to see me. Now, only today I had dealings with um, a chap who's in chronic pain. He suffers with degenerative back pain, disc problems. I believe you suffered recently with a problem with your back. He became so desperate, he's not been able to work for a year. Um, his income is statutory sick pay. That's not enough to live on. His pain isn't controlled. He's not been able to access physiotherapy, and he took an overdose. People are getting so desperate that they're thinking, I better off take my own life because that seems to be the only way to end my suffering. And this is returning to the days pre NHS, where elderly people, disabled people didn't want to be a burden, didn't want to cost their family any money, and they decided to take their life. And we know when the NHS was announced in 1946, there was a big drop in the suicide rate amongst the elderly and the sick. But we're returning to those days, I'm afraid. You hear stories of patients of mine pulling out their own teeth because they can't afford to see the dentist, or they take out a second loan to pay for their hip replacement because they can't put up with the agony and the disability and the poor quality of life. So every day I'm reminded that we have a dysfunctional NHS which has plenty of money going into it, but the money is being siphoned away from the delivery of care. We could run a very good health system if we paid attention to what was making people sick in the first place: poor nutrition, chronic stress, a inhumane economic system that forces everybody to work for a pittance, Two, three family members working, maybe working two or three jobs, no time for their children, a breakdown in social cohesion and the family life, and the obvious knock on effects on their psychology and their physical and mental health.
Yeah, I guess that I mean, you've sort of answered one of the other questions I was going to ask you, Bob, because again, you get people who often say, well, it doesn't really matter who's actually providing it so long as it's free at the point of need. And we know now, don't we, that much of the National Health Service provision will have the NHS badge, but it's actually the private sector. So just unpack that a little bit more. You've sort of already touched on that, Bob, but why does it matter? I mean, it says National Health Service outside, people go in, it's free. What's the problem with that people need to be aware of?
Yeah, so this rhetoric about free at the point of use is deceptive because private insurance is free at the point of use. You only get to send the bill later on, right? So it's deceptive language. The principle of the NHS was always public provision, because then you can control the quality of the staff delivering it. You're in charge of the training, you're in charge of the resources, and you maintain good standards. When you get the private sector in, they want to have their cheapest possible workforce and look for the most profitable work. So what do? They avoid high risk areas of medicine. So they don't want to run A&E departments, but they're quite happy to run urgent care centers. They don't want to run intensive care units because that's extremely expensive and not profitable. So they will cherry pick the activities they're involved with. And what that ends up doing is destabilizing the rest of the NHS, because there's always this cross fertilization, cross subsidy, and also the training, which is important. So we know that when you introduce profit into healthcare, it creates perverse incentives. So one example might be if you have a fee for service system, which is you go along, you see the doctor, he decides you need this, that, and the other operation. Well, there becomes a problem where there's an incentive for the doctor to say you need maybe a bigger operation than is genuinely the case, right? Because there's more profit to be made. So it breaks down that trust. Also, you get fraud. So, in the fee for service system, was to stop the provider billing for two operations when they've done one operation. So then you need an expensive monitoring system and charging system and billing system. So you have an army of administrators increasing the cost of running the service. Whereas healthcare is a natural monopoly for one other important reason, which is this concept of information asymmetry. Now, when you go to buy a toaster, you might look at three or four toasters on the shelf. Maybe you ask the salesman. Maybe you look up on some consumer website and make a choice. But I put it to you, when you're having your heart attack or your stroke, you're not in a position to shop around for the best stroke unit, and neither are you in a position to interrogate the credentials of the doctor or the consultant looking after you. So it is a deeply flawed concept. The private sector isn't a charity. It wants to maximize profit. And if it means giving you treatment that you don't need or letting you die, so be it. And all you have to do is look at the American system, which is twice as expensive as ours. It excludes the elderly and it excludes the poor. So the state has to step in. It's endemically fraudulent. At least 10% of the US budget goes out in fraud. That was an estimate done by Donald Berwick a few years ago. The third highest cause of death after cancer and heart disease is medical error, because they have a fragmented, chaotic system where everybody's just doing their little bit, adding on their little drug, doing their extra investigation with no overview or nobody really taking the interest of what's best for this patient. And that was the role of the NHS, and particularly the GP, as the central person with high continuity of care, who had a relationship over years with the patient, who actually, to get their own job satisfaction and feel like they're doing a good job, to have a handle on the patient, to understand the patient's need, to understand the family dynamic. That continuity, that relationship, that trust has been decimated by successive reforms, and they've done it by incentivizing GPs to destroy continuity and to adopt ways of working that are more bureaucratic, more delegation, and taking more risk.
Yeah. I guess you feel you've joined the Workers' Party now, that the Workers' Party is best placed to make the case for the National Health Service compared to other political parties. Would that be a fair assessment of one of the reasons why you've joined?
Absolutely. So I've been supporting the Workers' Party from the beginning. I was at the inaugural meeting. I've done several meetings with them. I've spoken to George on his Moats show. You know, if anybody invites me, even if the Conservative Party invite me to speak, I will tell them to their face the disastrous policies that they have pursued. And in fact, quite surprisingly, maybe the targets of these reforms are not the poor and the sick, Chris. They're going to be allowed to suffer. The targets of the reforms are the conservative voting middle classes who will be fleeced of their premium and then be priced out of care when they become expensive or unceremoniously dumped. And where will they be dumped? On an NHS that is now a skid row service. So it's in the self-interest of the whole sections of society to have a strong NHS which is functioning in the interest of the patients and not the interest of shareholders.
Mm. I mean, one of the other key pledges in the 10-point program that the Workers' Party published was this about commitment to providing free nursery provision, providing laundries for people, which is a novel concept in a way, because very often you have both parents, or maybe single parents, working, and running a house and holding down a full-time job, and people often have to do that, because the various bills and commitments that they have. Having those sorts of free facilities would lift a burden. What's your thoughts on that particular commitment, Bob? And how do you think that would sort of have an impact on your patients and their well-being? I mean, presumably it would be a positive benefit for them.
Yeah, so the biggest worry for people that I see, what stresses them out the most, what causes anxiety, what causes them to become depressed, is financial insecurity. If you add on top of that precarious work, insecure housing, that adds a lot of stress, and the root cause of that is our pathetic wages for people who in sort of ordinary jobs. So that creates its own problems, and the more support we can provide, and certainly increasing childcare capacity allows for mothers to not only be mothers but also combine work if they so wish to. But we mustn't overlook the importance of mothers being around for children, particularly in their early years. But yeah, subsidized uh, childcare is a very good idea, but it has to be of high quality. It has to be run where there are low carer to children relationships, so that time in childcare is very beneficial to the children. And the more stable and supportive psychological environment children have, the better they will become well-adjusted adults and productive and contributing to society.
Well, listen, Bob, it's been great having you on today, and I'm absolutely delighted that you've joined forces with the Workers' Party. I do feel that the Workers' Party is in a good position now to move forward and make an impact in the next election and give people a genuine choice, an alternative to the status quo, which is all that's on offer from the mainstream political parties. So I shall be certainly looking forward to campaigning alongside you, and you're certainly a big beast, as it were, and someone who is well known, and someone who is recognised as being principled and standing up for what's right, and standing up in particular for the National Health Service. So you will be a huge asset to the Workers' Party. Bob, how can people follow your work? I think we've put your Twitter handle on the screen, but are there any other ways in which people can keep up with your work, or is it simply through your social media platform?
Twitter is the most active, but there are other resources out there if people want to read and get themselves familiar, particularly with NHS stuff that we've done. There's a website called thegreatnhsheist.com. There's a YouTube channel, the Great NHS Heist YouTube channel. There's lots of material on there other than just the documentary. We've made short films. One that seems to be quite pertinent at the moment was what we warned that would happen to GP services following the 2019 contract change for GPs, where unfortunately our union said it would be a good idea to accept 100% subsidy for GPs to employ non-doctors. So now we have the perverse situation where there's not enough doctors. However, the financial incentives for GPs are against employing other doctors. So you have unemployed doctors in a desert of doctors. So yeah, so there's much more material on the website and videos on the YouTube channel, and people can DM me on my Twitter channel as well.
Excellent. Well, thanks again, Bob, for joining us this evening, and hopefully you'll have inspired a few more people to join forces with the Workers' Party, and let's try and build this movement and build a genuine alternative, because the political system in this country is totally broken. We've got the mainstream political parties are enthralled to the military-industrial complex, and they're both signed up to the neoliberal economic agenda, which has wrought absolute havoc across the country, particularly for working class communities. And that's why we have over 14 million people living in poverty, and around 1.5 million people absolutely destitute in one of the biggest economies in the world, the sixth, in fact, biggest economy in the world. It's an absolute scandal that we have the levels of poverty and deprivation and inequality. It's totally unnecessary, and we can build an alternative and give people a real chance of creating a good society. And that's what the Workers' Party is committed to doing. So thanks again, Bob, for joining us tonight. And thanks for joining the Workers' Party. And thank you, everybody, for watching this evening. We hope to be back next week at the same time. So until then, this is Chris Williamson saying bye for now.